Everyone in town fears a mysterious widow in black, but a lonely rancher who's been alone for 12 years calls her beautiful. And that's how their super sweet love story starts changing everything. That's the hook that'll warm your heart, pal. Let's check it out. Everyone feared the widow in black until the lonely rancher for 12 years called her beautiful. Dustwater Saloon, Arizona Territory, late autumn evening, 1887. The saloon smelled of whiskey, horses, and wood smoke. It was the kind of smell that stuck to your clothes long after you left, and to your soul if you stayed too long. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Tin lanterns swung gently above rough wooden tables, casting long shadows that danced with the low murmur of conversation. A poker game clacked near the back. A fiddle played lazily in one corner, half drowned by drunken laughter. Outside, the wind howled through the empty main street like a coyote mourning a ghost. But inside the Dustwater Saloon, the name on every tongue was not a ghost. It was a woman. "I'm telling you," slurred Jeb Dawson. Wiry man with a Rusco-colored beard stained by chew. She cursed every man she ever touched. "That's 3 husbands, boys. Count them 3. Dead as dust." Across the room, men leaned in closer, their mugs halfway to their mouths. Jeb pounded the table for emphasis. First one fell off his horse and split his skull. Second one poisoned, they say, with his own tonic. Third, the sheriff himself took a bullet to the head behind his own desk. And who was the last to see him alive? That black-veiled widow, always that woman. "She ain't no widow," spat another man, young and sunburned with prairie dust still caked to his boots. "She's a witch. That's what my mama called her. A shadow walking a curse in skirts. She don't even speak," said a third, voice low with fear. "Just stares like she's already seeing your funeral." The table went quiet. Even the fiddle paused a beat. Jeb leaned in, voice dropping to a raspy whisper. "They say if you lay with her, you dream of fire. And if you kiss her, your heart gives out by morning." Laughter erupted, half nervous, half cruel. "Hell, I'd still take my chances," one cowboy joked, slamming back his drink. "Better to die in her bed than rot alone like some mule." That was when a voice came from the shadows. "I see something different." All heads turned toward the far corner where a lone man sat nursing a single glass of rye, James Callahan. The name passed between lips like a chill. Rancher once known for wild horses and a family of 3 until disease took them 12 winters ago. Since then he spoke to few and trusted fewer. But when James Callahan spoke, folks listened. Jeb squinted into the dark. "Say what, Callahan?" James lifted, his glass, eyes fixed on the fire. "I see something different." There was a pause, a cough, the flutter of lantern flame. Jeb pushed back from the table, voice mocking. "You see beauty in that cursed woman, huh? Next you'll be saying rattlesnakes are misunderstood." James didn't flinch. His voice was even quiet as the snow that sometimes fell in this sun-shed land. "I see grief worn like a coat you can't take off. I see silence that never asked to be feared. And I see a woman who survived more judgment than any man in this room could bear." The air thickened. Someone muttered, "You want to be number 4? Then be our guest." James turned his head slowly, his gaze cutting through the haze like a whip. "I ain't afraid of death," he said. "What scares me is living so long that I forget how to see." Another silence. This one held. A younger cowboy, emboldened by drink, scoffed. "That's real poetic, old man, but you sure you ain't lost your damn mind?" James stood slow and deliberate. His boots echoed against the saloon floorboards as he walked past the flickering hearth light. He stopped beside the men and looked them each in the eye. "You're good with things that cannot speak," he said. The room went cold. "Maybe you're right," James added, tipping his hat. "Maybe she's a curse. But if she is, I'd still rather be cursed by beauty than blessed by cowards." He left his half-empty glass on the bar, untouched. Then he walked out into the wind. They said she once laughed like the bell at St. Mary's, clear and golden, before the veils, before the silence. Elizabeth Ray was born into money, her father Charles. Ray ran the only bank between Dustwater and Three Crossings. Her mother died young, and so Elizabeth grew up in lace gloves and library halls reading poetry while the frontier burned outside. She could have left, but she stayed. And at 19, she married Jonas Blackwell, a cavalryman with a smile made for promises. He died 6 months later. The official report said the horse threw him during a canyon patrol. Locals whispered he had taken to drinking after the wedding, that maybe it was not the fall that killed him, but despair. Elizabeth wore black at the funeral, though the dress had been meant for their church wedding, still hanging in the wardrobe when they buried him. A year later, she married Henry. Cole, wealthy, older, refined. He sold medicines and land deeds and believed Elizabeth needed structure. She gave him grace. He gave her poison. That was what the coroner eventually ruled, though no one ever proved who laced the wine. By then, whispers had begun. Not just about bad luck, about something darker. When she married the town sheriff, Thomas Ray, she stopped attending social calls. Some said he kept her hidden. Others said she preferred shadows. They fought often, loudly. The last time it ended with Thomas slumped over his desk, blood on the papers. The town decided it was an accident, a pistol, discharged in rage, but Elizabeth never spoke a word in her defense. She just stood there, black, veiled down, lips pressed like the hinges of a sealed coffin. After Thomas, the door to her grand home creaked closed and rarely opened. Her father had died the year before. The servants left. She stayed, a ghost in silk. Children dared each other to run up to her gate and touch it. Men crossed the street when they saw her shadow. Women prayed she would not look at their babies, but she did not look at anyone until the day James Callahan saw her, kneeling in the dirt just outside the churchyard road. It was late afternoon, dusty and dry. A wild Mustang, injured and limping, had collapsed under a mesquite tree. Most folks would have shot it. Elizabeth did not. She had wrapped its leg with a torn hem of her own dress and was pouring water slowly into its cracked mouth. James dismounted quietly. He had been on his way to the feed store, reins loose in one hand, a bag of oats on the saddle. But what he saw stopped him. She did not look up when he approached. Her face was calm, her hands steady. "Not many would do that," he said softly. Still no reply. James waited a moment, then added, "You're better with the wounded than most doctors I've seen." Elizabeth's eyes flicked toward him, not startled, just aware. Present. He nodded at the horse. "You're good with things that cannot speak." Finally, her voice, dry and soft like paper, left too long in the sun. "Animals do not lie." James tilted his head. "Neither do the dead." A pause. "You're good with fragile things," he added, gentler this time. "Better than you are with people." Her stare held for a moment, then broke. She turned without a word, rising to her feet, and walked away. The Mustang remained breathing behind her, leg bound with care. James watched her leave, boots silent on the dust. He never said a word after, just touched the brim of his hat. What he did not see, what no one saw, was how when she passed the corner of the blacksmith's shop, Elizabeth paused just long enough to wipe a single tear from her cheek. The first gift was left quietly just before sunrise, a small bundle of dry alfalfa carefully tied with twine, placed gently beside the rusted gate of Elizabeth's old estate. Tucked into the twine was a folded scrap of paper, creased but clean. Not everyone believes the rumors. That was all it said. No name, no signature. Elizabeth found it mid-morning. She stood in silence, staring down at the bundle. The wind picked up around her, but she did not move for a long time. Then, slowly she bent, lifted the offering with both hands, and disappeared behind the gate. That night, just after midnight, James stepped onto his porch to find the same bundle of hay sitting neatly by his steps. No note this time, no words, just silence returned. He did not smile. He only stood there breathing in the scent of distant rain. 3 days passed. Then came a small clay pot with a wild flower not native to Dustwater. It was blue with delicate petals and a fragile stalk. James had grown it in his greenhouse, one of the few things he still nurtured. He placed it carefully by her gate, no note attached. By noon the next day, it was gone. A week later, a small parcel appeared by the entrance to his barn. Inside, a tiny bottle of dried ink and a brass fountain. Pen, older than anything sold in town. There was no note, but the gesture was unmistakable. She had read his first letter. She had understood, and she had answered. Neither spoke aloud, not once, not in words, but their silence grew louder. It filled the gaps between each exchanged token, like threads stitching together a quiet language. A ribbon from an old bonnet, a stone smoothed by creek water, a worn leather bookmark slipped between. The planks of his fence. Nothing extravagant, just proof of noticing, proof of thought. Then came the storm. Rain rolled over Dustwater like a drum beat from the heavens. Thunder cracked above the hills, and the sky wept through the night. Wind tore through the trees, and fences broke like twigs. In the dark, James lay, awake thinking of her home, old, brittle, half forgotten by everyone but him. By morning, the rain had gone, leaving behind a world soaked in stillness. Elizabeth opened her door to find her front fence, once broken and collapsed, restored. The boards were replaced. The gate rehung on new hinges. Mud had been cleared from the walk, and her porch swept clean of fallen leaves. No one stood nearby. No cart tracks, no footprints, nothing to say who had come, but she knew. She stepped forward, hands trembling just slightly, and touched the wood. It was sturdy, clean, dry. Her knees gave a little as she lowered herself onto the steps, staring at the fence as if it were a thing alive, a thing that had chosen not to give up on her. Her hands covered her mouth, and for the first time in years, she cried. Not for the deaths, not for the lies, not for the town, but because someone had rebuilt something she thought no one remembered, because someone had seen the ruin and chosen not to look away. The days, after the storm settled into quiet, not the kind of silence that suffocated, but the kind that allowed old things to rise. Memory, regret, hope in cautious steps. James sat on his porch, the scent of wet earth still fresh in the wind. In his hand, a tin cup of black coffee long gone cold. He stared out at the horizon where the hills met the clouds like hands pressed in prayer and let his mind drift to a time he had sealed away. Her name had been Clara. She laughed with her whole face, saying to their daughter while stirring soup, and planted sunflowers outside the kitchen window. He had built that house for her with his bare hands, every beam, every floorboard. Then the fever came. It swept through the valley like smoke with no fire, and no one saw it coming. Clara was the first, then little Annie, just 6, clinging to her doll even as her tiny body burned from the inside out. James buried them himself. No church bells, no neighbors, just earth and tears. After that, he spoke less. Trusted no one. He kept a rifle over the door, not for intruders, but for mercy, just in case the grief ever got too loud. For years passed. He learned how to live with silence, how to speak to horses better than men, and how to keep his hands busy so his heart would not wander until the woman who spoke. With her eyes and answered with the quiet language of returned gifts. Across town, Elizabeth stood in the attic of her father's house beneath a beam still darkened from an old kitchen fire. Smoke stains crept across the ceiling like faded fingerprints. Dust swirled in the morning light. She pulled a trunk from under a sheet and opened it slowly. Inside lay her first wedding dress, once ivory, now yellowed by time, edges curled like parchment. The hem was scorched on one side, ruined in the fire that had started the night after Henry Cole's funeral. They said she left a candle burning in grief. She never corrected them. She touched the fabric, feeling every stitch like a pulse long since faded. The lace sleeves, the ribbon sash, the way her mother had helped her into it, hands trembling with joy. She had been 19. She had believed in forever. "Am I still someone worth loving?" she whispered aloud. The question hung there soft and unanswered, not just because she had outlived 3 husbands, but because the world had carved her into something brittle, because she had learned to flinch before she hoped, because when people looked at her, they saw death before they saw her name. She folded the dress and laid it gently back inside. Outside her window, children ran past the gate, not screaming, not daring each other to knock, just running, laughing. One paused and waved. Elizabeth raised her hand in return, fingers pressed to the glass. She did not wave back, but she did not turn away either. That evening, she stepped outside to find a new flower blooming in the garden James had made. It was blue, delicate, with petals so thin they trembled in the breeze. Beside it, a small sign carved from pine. Hope. She knelt beside the boom, brushing the soil gently. In the distance, James watched from the trail above, hat in hand, heart in throat. Neither spoke, but between them something quiet and old began to thaw. The journal was old, its spine cracked, pages brittle, but James turned them slowly, careful with each motion. It had belonged to Dr. Horace Bell, a traveling physician who'd passed through Duskwater over a decade ago. Most entries were routine: coughs, fevers, dates. But one note near the back stopped him cold. Man in an old gray duster. Never gives a name, always nearby when something goes wrong. Seen near the Cole estate twice. Watched the house for hours. Henry Cole, Elizabeth's second husband. James read. The line again, his gut tightening. Henry had died from poisoning, officially ruled inconclusive. But everyone had whispered Elizabeth's name. Then came Sheriff Thomas Ray, husband number 3, shot dead in his office during an argument over inheritance, declared an accident. But James had seen too much death to believe in that kind of luck. He remembered the letters, the anonymous ones Elizabeth received after each tragedy. He had once picked up a torn scrap outside her gate. The writing was jagged, unhinged. You carry death like perfume. James still had that piece. He pulled it from his drawer now and compared it to an old letter he'd seen once years ago, something Elizabeth had donated for a church auction. It was from her first husband, Jonas Blackwell. The handwriting matched. Slanted F's, hooked R's, identical Y's. Jonas was supposed to be dead, killed in a riding accident at 24, mauled by coyotes, they'd said. Closed casket, no body ever seen. Just grief and questions. James saddled his horse and rode to Fort Bramble, the last place Jonas had served as a cavalryman. The post was mostly abandoned, but an old quartermaster still kept the stables. James showed him the photo. "Yeah, I remember him," the man said. "Quiet, odd, had trouble with drink, fought with his wife back home." "He died," James replied. The old man snorted, "Nope." Ran, took his gear and rifle, left his dog tags in a boot full of blood, called it desertion. That was 15 years back. James felt a chill crawl through his chest. Saw a man like him 5 years ago, the quartermaster added. Different name, dirty, paid in silver, bought bullets, and vanished. The next days blurred, asking questions, following rumors, piecing together a trail few had noticed. Eventually, it led James into the woods north of Dustwater, where the pines thickened and the paths faded to nothing. There, hidden beneath a ridge, stood a shack. Inside, the air wryer of mildew and rust. James stepped in and froze. The back wall was covered in images, sketches, clippings, faded photos, all of Elizabeth, her weddings, her walking through town, standing beside graves pinned beneath the pictures. Scraps, a veil, a broken locket, a shrine or a warning, and then a voice. "You found it," the man said. "You found us." Jonas Blackwell stood in the shadows, gaunt, wild-eyed, hair matted with gray. James didn't flinch. "She thought you were dead," he said. "I am," Jonas replied. "To the world, but not to her. She mourned you. Then you made her suffer." "I gave her everything," Jonas hissed. "She threw it away, married liars, laughed like I never mattered. You murdered those men. They weren't her husbands. I still am." James's eyes hardened. "No, you do not want her back. You want her ruined, so no one else will ever want her." Jonas lunged. The fight was fierce, rage against resolve, but James was stronger. He pinned the man down, breath heaving. "I don't want her gone," James said. "I want her to live." Jonas snarled, beaten. That night, the sheriff's men surrounded the shack. Jonas Blackwell, long thought dead, was led from the woods in chains. And the widow in black finally had a name for the ghost that had haunted her. They brought Jonas Blackwell into town in chains under the watch of 3 deputies and a sheriff who could barely hide the disbelief on his face. Dustwater had not seen a public trial in over a decade, much less one where the defendant was a man long presumed dead. The town's people crowded the courthouse steps, murmuring like a stirred beehive. Some pressed against the windows, others crossed themselves as the wagon passed. Mothers held their children close. Few looked Elizabeth in the eye when she stepped down from the buggy, clad in her usual black, but this time without the veil. Inside the courtroom, the air was heavy with heat and judgment. Jonas sat shackled at the front, thinner than the townsfolk remembered, but still with that maddening glint in his eye. Elizabeth walked in slowly, her boots clicking against the wood. She held no Bible, wore no jewelry, only resolve. He stopped in the center of the courtroom and looked directly at him. Her voice, though quiet, cut through the noise. "Why did you not just kill? Me too?" Jonas smiled, a twisted curl of lips that once charmed but now curdled the blood. "Because death forgives," he said. "I do not." A gasp rippled through the room. James stood nearby, silent but unshakable, his jaw tight. The judge called for order, and the trial began. James presented the evidence first. The burned journal pages, from the traveling doctor, the original letter in Jonas's handwriting, the matching ink, the sketches, the veil, the shrine of madness found in the woods. The quartermaster from Fort Bramble testified next, recalling the desertion, the stolen equipment, and the man who vanished with a false death. A former cavalryman spoke of recognizing Jonas under a false name years later in town, hiding in plain sight. Then came the physician, now older, voice rasping but sure as he described the stranger who had always been near when death came for Elizabeth's husbands. The courtroom buzzed with unease as each thread tied tighter around Jonas's neck. Elizabeth was the last to speak. She stood before them all, not as the widow in black, not as the cursed woman, but as herself. And for the first time, her voice carried weight, not of burden, but of truth. "After my first husband died, People brought me food. After the second, they brought me suspicion. After the third, they brought me silence. She paused. I was not allowed to cry, not in public. Not in private, because if I did, it meant guilt. And if I did not, it meant I was heartless. I could not mourn. I could not breathe. They told stories about me, she said, eyes sweeping the crowd, and not one of them ever asked for mine. She turned back toward Jonas, who stared back with a strange calm, as if this too had been part of the plan. I have been killed 3 times, she said softly, but with steel in her throat. And not one of you needed a bullet. Silence, complete, unforgiving. Even the judge sat still, his gavel frozen mid-air. Then from the gallery a figure stood, an old man in priest's robes, voice shaking. It was Father Kalen, the town's oldest clergyman. We did this, he said quietly. Not the poison, not the bullet. We did with our whispers, with our stares. He looked to Elizabeth. I ask your forgiveness for the sermons I gave in your absence, for the prayers I did not say. Elizabeth's lips parted, but no words came. She only gave the smallest nod. The jury returned within the hour. Jonas. Blackwell found guilty of premeditated murder, 2 counts, fraud, conspiracy, malicious defamation, unlawful flight, the sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out within a fortnight. As the verdict was read, Jonas never looked at the judge. He only stared at Elizabeth, lips curled in a final muttered whisper. She'll never be free of me. But when he was let out, she did not flinch. She turned to face the town, and for the first time in 15 years, they did not look away. Spring came late to Dustwater that year, as if the land itself had waited, holding its breath for a story to end and another to begin. The winds turned warm, the rivers whispered again, and for the first time in over a decade, the old bells of St. Jude's rang, not for a funeral, but for a welcome. They rang for her. The town sent. Word quietly at first, then with growing courage, Elizabeth Ray was invited to return to Sunday service. Not by mandate, not by spectacle, but by choice, by community, by hearts, learning how to make amends. She stood at the doorway of her home the morning of her return, fingers grazing the gate. James had once rebuilt after the storm. The wood had aged, weathered, but remained strong like her. When she stepped out, the town didn't freeze or stare. They simply nodded. A woman offered her a seat. A boy handed her a folded wildflower. And when the hymns began, no one looked away when she sang. At her home, something new had begun to bloom. Literally, James had spent nights on his knees, quietly working the soil in her front garden. He said nothing about it, left no note. But each morning she found new patches of blue wild cornflowers, desert lupins, bellflowers, delicate things grown in the same ground where no one had dared, stepped for years. He did not ask to plant them, he simply planted. The blue grew like a tide, a reclamation. Neighbors passed and noticed. Children paused, pointing through the fence. One morning, a little girl, shy and dust-faced, asked if she could learn to plant some too. Elizabeth bent down, smiled, and handed the girl a small wooden trowel. That was how it began. Within a week, children returned, some with seeds, others with drawings. Elizabeth, who once heard only silence from her windows, now heard laughter, tiny footsteps, the soft thud of digging hands. She taught them how to water without drowning, how to feel the roots, how to recognize patience. And when the flowers bloomed, the children called it the Blue Garden. Even the adults began to change. Neighbors dropped off spare tools. One man offered to mend her shutters. Another brought a jar of honey without a word. It was not redemption. It was not pity. It was the beginning of remembering her as a person, not a myth, not a mistake. At the Spring Lantern Festival, the town gathered by the river as they had in better days. The air was full of laughter, fiddle music, and the scent of roasted corn and sweet cakes. Lanterns floated like stars on strings, swaying in the breeze. Elizabeth stepped into the square wearing a dress of pale blue, the same shade as the flowers James had grown for her. Her hair, once tightly pinned and hidden beneath mourning veils, now fell softly around her shoulders. For a long moment, people just watched, but not with suspicion, with awe. James found her near the edge of the square, beneath a hanging lantern that cast soft gold across her face. He took one step closer. Slow, reverent. "You do not have to be anyone's wife," he said gently, "just for her ears. You only have to be the woman who lives like she belongs to herself." Elizabeth looked at him, eyes bright, not with tears, but with something clearer. "And you," she whispered back, "are the first man who saw me when I thought I was already gone." He offered his hand. She took it, and beneath the drifting lanterns, surrounded by music and voices that once cursed her name, Elizabeth Ray danced, not as a widow, not as a ghost, but as a woman reborn. The blue garden waited for her return, and so did James. The dust of old judgments never settled on the porch of the Callahan Ranch, not anymore. After the trial in the lantern-lit spring festival, Elizabeth Ray packed what little she had and left behind the empty halls of her father's house. She did not look back. She did not need to. She walked into the hills toward the small windswept home where James had lived, alone for 12 long winters. This time he opened the door wide, not just to his house but to everything that had been locked inside him for so many years. They began slow, quiet, as if rebuilding something sacred. Elizabeth cooked while James fixed the broken shelves. She planted herbs by the windowsill. Built her a drying shed for roots and leaves. Some days they hardly spoke, but the silence between them felt nothing like the silence she had known before. One evening, as the sky turned a deep violet and the last of the sun spilled across the pasture, James took her hand. "No fanfare, no kneeling. You do not have to wear a white dress," he said softly. "You do not have to stand before a crowd or speak vows out loud. You have worn sorrow long enough. If you can wear hope, will you wear it with me for the rest of our days?" Elizabeth looked up at him, the light catching the blue in her eyes. "I have worn grief like a second skin," she said. "It is time I dressed in love." They married beneath the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the pasture, its roots tangled in a memory older than both of them. Only a handful of people came, those who had stood by them, those who had changed. Elizabeth wore a white dress stitched with soft blue flowers, hand-embroidered by a widow who once feared her name. The lace near her collar was made from a handkerchief her mother had sewn when she was a girl. James wore his usual work shirt and a clean vest, but on his finger he placed a simple band of silver melted down from the old revolver he once kept hidden in a locked chest. It was not just a ring. It was a promise that no more ghosts would be carried into their future. The ranch blossomed not just with flowers, but with life. Elizabeth turned the side yard into a healing garden. Lavender, echgonadia, yarrow, mint. The town brought her sick animals, stray cats, injured dogs, wounded hawks. She took them all. No questions, no payment. James taught orphaned boys to ride, to build fences, to clean stables. He taught them how to be gentle with frightened things, how to speak with hands instead of fists. People began to whisper again, but this time with reverence. They called her the Lady of the Blue Garden, a woman who had returned from the dead, not with vengeance, but with purpose. Her porch became a place of tea and stories. Her kitchen, a haven for children who had no mothers. They lived simply, honestly, deeply. One summer evening, Elizabeth placed a letter in James's desk drawer. It was sealed with a sprig of pressed thyme. He found it after feeding the horses, his hands still smelling of hay and leather. You did not just love me. You chose me when everyone else turned away. You believed me when the town demanded I confess to things I never did. And you held my hand not because of where I came from, but because of where we could go. I have carried 3 funerals in my heart, but today I carry only one name: your wife. Years later, on a golden afternoon thick with laughter, James and Elizabeth stood side by side on the hill above their home. Below them, the blue garden danced in the breeze, filled with children chasing each other between rows of blossoms. James slipped his hand into hers. "They used to call you a witch," he said softly, eyes on the field. "Now they call you the miracle of Dustwater." Elizabeth smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "And you," she whispered, "are the answer to every prayer I thought God had forgotten." The wind rustled the leaves, and the blue flowers nodded in quiet agreement. Thank you for riding with us through this unforgettable tale of redemption, devotion, and the kind of love that heals even the deepest wounds. If Elizabeth Ray's journey from cursed widow to cherished wife moved your heart, imagine what other stories wait to be told beneath the dust and stars of the old frontier. Subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more hauntingly beautiful romances, born in lawless lands where bullets missed, but hearts never did. Hit that bell icon so you never miss a single story of forbidden love, fearless devotion, and the kind of truth that outlives time. This is where legends fall in love. This is Legends of the Wild West Stories.